July 1943, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The first thing Johann Reiter noticed was not the barbed wire. It was the smell. Real coffee, hot bread, meat fat rising off a kitchen griddle in the middle of a summer afternoon. Johann stopped in the mess line with 300 captured German soldiers behind him, still wearing the dust of Tunisia in the seams of their uniforms. For months, they had been told America was hollow, soft, undisciplined, a country of factories and movies, not endurance. Then an American cook slid a tray toward him, 2 slices of beef, mashed potatoes with butter melting into them, green beans, cornbread, a cup of coffee, and beside it all, as if it were nothing, a square of peach cobbler still warm from the pan. Johann did not pick up the tray. He looked at the food, then he looked at the cook. The cook looked back, bored, not proud, not theatrical, just bored, and that was what frightened Johann most. Because a show has energy, propaganda has a smile, a trap has tension. This had none of that. This was routine. The American cook tapped the counter and said, "Move it along." Johann moved, but he carried that tray like it was evidence. Not dinner, evidence behind him. Feldwebel Ernst Vogt whispered that they were being photographed, that this meal was temporary, that tomorrow the Americans would show their real face. Johann wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him. Because if this tray was normal, then the arithmetic of the war had been wrong from the beginning, and no soldier wants to learn that from a spoonful of potatoes. Johann had been a schoolmaster's assistant outside WWII before he was drafted. He had corrected children's handwriting. He had taught boys to recite maps and girls to keep neat columns of numbers. By 1941, he was wearing a field gray uniform, and being told those same neat columns proved Germany could outlast its enemies. Fuel, steel, grain, shipping. The numbers always arrived clean. The speeches always arrived confident. America, they were told, could build machines but not men. America could produce plenty but not sacrifice. America could feed itself only because it had not yet understood hardship. Then North Africa began eating those speeches alive. Trucks arrived late. Ammunition arrived short. Bread came hard, gray, and broken into portions so small that men argued over crumbs. By the final weeks before surrender in Tunisia, Johann's company had learned to listen for engines, not because engines meant help, but because they meant somebody else still had fuel. When he was captured, he weighed 124 pounds. He did not know that number. The American doctor would write it down later. At the time, he only knew that his belt had run out of holes. His gums bled when he brushed them, and sometimes he stood up too quickly and the whole desert went white. So when the transport brought him across the Atlantic, and then by train into the American South, he expected hunger with a different accent. He expected punishment. He expected the enemy's revenge. What he found was a camp with painted signs, wooden barracks, gravel paths, water towers, guard towers, and a mess hall that smelled better than the last Christmas he had spent at home. Camp Aliceville had opened only weeks earlier, one of the hundreds of American prisoner camps built to hold captured Axis soldiers far from the fighting. To Johann, it looked less like a prison than a town designed by quartermasters. Rows of barracks, wash buildings, a chapel space, a dispensary, work rosters, kitchen schedules, storage sheds with doors that opened and closed all day. Everything moved. Everything had a place. And inside that order, the first meal waited. He sat at a long table with the tray in front of him and tried not to stare. The beef was not enormous. That was the worst part. It was not a feast piled high for a camera. It was simply enough. Enough meat, enough vegetables, enough bread, enough coffee, enough dessert. Enough that the Americans did not appear to notice the miracle. Across from Johann, a young prisoner named Karl Weiss touched the cornbread with 2 fingers, then pulled back as if it might disappear. Karl had been a baker's son in Bremen. He had not smelled yellow cornmeal before, and he did not know what to do with it. Ernst Vogt leaned close and said, "Eat slowly." His voice carried authority but not certainty. "Make it last." Johann cut into the beef. The knife went through without force. For 1 second, he was not in Alabama. He was back in his mother's kitchen before the ration cards became the center of the room, before turnips replaced potatoes, before coffee became roasted barley and imagination. He tasted salt, fat, heat. Then his stomach cramped so sharply that he lowered the fork. Not from sickness, from memory. At the end of the table, Oberleutnant Dieter Schramm was doing what officers do when terror has no proper uniform. He was calculating. Schramm had served in supply. He had watched the Desert Campaign turn into a ledger of shortages. He knew how many calories a marching man needed, how many gallons a truck burned, how many crates disappeared between port and front, how much meat existed in a depot when the papers claimed more than the shelves held. Now he looked down the table at 300 trays, then through the serving window at more pans waiting for the next shift. He whispered, not to anyone in particular, "This cannot be the enemy." No one answered. Because there are arguments a man can make against newspapers. There are arguments he can make against broadcasts. There are arguments he can make against rumors. But there are very few arguments against a full tray in both hands. That night, in Barracks 18, the prisoners built explanations around the meal. It was a trick. It was the first-day ration. It was only for Afrika prisoners, because the Red Cross might inspect them. It was only because they had arrived weak. It was because the Americans wanted obedience. It was because the Americans were trying to poison their loyalty. Each explanation lasted until breakfast. Breakfast was worse. Eggs, not powdered gray paste hidden in bread. Eggs with yellow centers, toast with jam, oatmeal with milk, coffee with sugar, a strip of bacon curled beside the plate. Johann watched an American corporal at the end of the line ask whether he wanted his eggs fried hard or soft. For a moment, Johann thought he had misunderstood the English. The corporal repeated the question, slower, hard or soft choice. That small word did more damage than the bacon. After months in which men took what appeared, when it appeared in whatever form it survived the road, the enemy was asking him how he preferred his eggs. Karl Weiss started laughing under his breath. It was not happy laughter. It was the laughter of a man whose mind has reached a locked door and discovered the door is painted on the wall. Ernst Vogt did not laugh. He stared down at his plate, then he pushed the bacon to the side, as if resisting one piece of meat could keep the whole world from changing. By the third day, the medical exams began. The prisoners were marched through a dispensary that smelled of soap, alcohol, and clean linen. American medics weighed them, checked teeth, checked eyes, checked skin, looked at gums, pressed fingers against ankles to see if swelling held. Men who had been told they were soldiers of a superior state now stood shirtless while enemy doctors wrote down the evidence of hunger. Johann was given vitamin tablets, extra milk, a note for additional servings until his weight improved. He expected mockery. He expected lectures. The nurse handing him the tablets only said, "Take these with food." That was all. No sermon, no insult, no speech about defeat. Just a system identifying a deficiency and moving supplies toward it. For Johann, that was harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Cruelty would have confirmed the story. Efficiency contradicted it. Kindness could be dismissed as theater. Procedure could not. The procedure kept repeating. At noon, they were fed. At evening, they were fed. The barracks were inspected. Laundry was issued. Razors appeared. Writing paper appeared. A camp notice board went up. Work details were organized. Schedules were posted. The Americans seemed to possess the one thing German propaganda had insisted they lacked: discipline without hysteria, order without slogans, abundance without performance. Dieter Schramm watched all of it with the expression of a man losing a war for the second time. The first defeat had happened in Tunisia, under artillery and aircraft and empty supply columns. The second was happening in Alabama, at a slower pace with clean forks. On the fifth evening, Schramm gathered several men near the back wall of the barracks. He spoke quietly. "The issue is not the meal," he said. "The meal is only the visible part." He took a scrap of paper and drew columns. One column for German field rations in North Africa, one for estimated American prisoner rations, one for civilian supply, one for transport burden. Johann watched the numbers form. Not official numbers. Better than official numbers, real numbers. Numbers made from trays, trucks, storage sheds, sacks of flour, barrels of potatoes, crates of oranges, and the careless speed with which the Americans replaced an empty pan before the line could slow. Schramm tapped the paper. "If they feed captured enemies this way," he said, "then what are they feeding their own divisions?" That question stayed in the barracks after the men stopped speaking. It crawled into bunks. It settled behind closed eyes, because everyone knew what the question meant. If this was the rear, if this was the prison, if this was what America spent on men who had shot at them, then the front was not facing an army. It was facing a continent that had learned to move. By the second week, the prisoners began to change physically, not dramatically, not like a miracle, more dangerously than that. Gradually, color returned to faces. Men stopped sleeping through every free hour. Arguments grew sharper because the minds inside the bodies had fuel again. A starving man protects beliefs differently than a fed one. Hunger narrows the world, food widens it. And once the world widened, the lies had more room to fall apart. The first major fight broke out over a newspaper. An American guard had left a stack of weak, old papers in the recreation room. At first the Germans assumed they were planted. Then they read them. The paper criticized American politicians' reported casualties, debated production priorities, argued over taxes, printed a cartoon mocking a senator, and then, on the next page, advertised refrigerators, canned peaches, new tires to be purchased after the war, and a department store sale for children's shoes. The prisoners gathered around the pages like men examining a captured weapon. Ernst Vogt jabbed a finger at the political column. "This is weakness," he said. "This is disorder." A thin university student named Peter Falk replied, "Then why are they not collapsing?" No one liked that question. Peter had studied law before the war took him. He had a scholar's habit of turning a statement over until the underside showed. He read another paragraph aloud, one in which an American writer accused the government of waste. Then he folded the paper carefully and looked at the barracks. "In Germany," he said, "this man would vanish." Silence answered him. Not agreement, not denial, Recognition, because every man in that room knew it was true. They had been told that unity was strength, that dissent was rot, that one voice made a nation harder. But across the ocean, a nation arguing with itself was building ships, tanks, camps, rations, radios, medicine, and enough spare jam to ask prisoners whether they wanted more toast. The contradiction did not resolve. It deepened, and that made it useful. The Americans did not have to prove they were strong by saying they were strong. They allowed enough freedom for their weaknesses to be printed. Then they kept producing anyway. That was a different kind of strength. One many of the prisoners had never been taught to recognize. In August, work assignments began. Johann was placed on an agricultural detail outside the wire, harvesting cotton and later helping repair fences after a storm tore through the county. The farmer who supervised them was named Henry Cobb. He was in his late 50s, too old for the army, with red skin at the neck and hands thickened by decades of weather. His oldest son was somewhere in the Pacific. His younger nephew was training in Georgia. If Henry hated the German prisoners, he did not have the energy to display it. He wanted the fence fixed. He wanted the cotton picked. He wanted the mule not to be frightened by strange voices. At midday, his wife Clara brought lunch in 2 baskets. Biscuits wrapped in cloth, ham, boiled eggs, peaches, a jug of sweet tea. She served the prisoners the same way she served the American guards, with a practical irritation that suggested hunger was an inconvenience she had no intention of entertaining. Johann took 1 biscuit, then hesitated. Clara noticed. She pushed another into his hand. "You're working," she said. He did not understand every word. He understood enough. That afternoon, standing in an Alabama field with cotton burrs scratching his wrists, Johann looked toward the farmhouse. A plain wooden building, not rich, not grand, no marble, no banners, no marching bands, just a farm family with 2 men away at war, and enough flour left to feed enemy prisoners under an oak tree. Ernst Vogt saw him looking. "Do not make saints out of them," Vogt muttered. Johann said nothing. He was not making saints out of them. That was the point. The Americans did not need to be saints for the evidence to stand. Ordinary people were doing ordinary things with a surplus Germany could not imagine. That made the evidence colder, less sentimental. More final letters from home arrived in September. They came slowly, censored, thinned by distance and damage. Johann received one from his sister Lotte. Her handwriting was smaller than before, as if paper itself had become a ration. She wrote that their mother was tired, that the school building had been damaged, that nights were difficult, that food was managed. She used that word twice. Managed German families had become skilled at hiding terror inside practical words. Johann read the letter. Beside his supper had been chicken stew, bread, carrots, coffee, and apple slices. He could still feel the weight of it in his stomach. His sister's letter weighed more. That was the first time captivity made him feel guilty. Not because he was alive, he had felt that before, but because he was full. His mother was hungry in a country that had demanded everything from her. And he, a defeated prisoner in Alabama, was being told to drink more milk around him. Other men read similar letters. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, Mannheim. Words carefully chosen, lines missing. News hinted at and not said. The war that had once felt like a map was becoming a list of kitchens going empty. That evening, Dieter Schramm stopped pretending. He stood near the stove at the center of the barracks and held a letter from his wife. For several seconds he did not speak. When he did, his officer's voice had gone rough. "We were not defeated because we lacked courage," he said. "We were defeated because courage was spent against arithmetic." No one interrupted him. "The men at the front paid for false numbers. Our families are paying for false promises. And every day here, they serve us proof." Ernst Vogt rose from his bunk. "Careful." Schramm looked at him. "No, we have been careful for too long." The barracks tightened. There were still loyal men among them. Men who believed defeat was temporary. Men who believed betrayal explained what material reality would not. Men who treated doubt as infection. Schramm knew they were there. He spoke anyway. "If a nation can feed its prisoners better than another nation can feed its children, then the second nation has not merely lost a battle, it has lost its claim to truth." That sentence divided the room. Not cleanly. Nothing human divides cleanly. Some men looked away. Some nodded. Some clenched their jaws. Some feared the words and loved them at the same time because they named what their bodies already knew. Johann did not speak. He folded his sister's letter along the crease and placed it under his pillow. But something in him had shifted beyond return. The lie had survived defeat. It had survived capture. It had survived the ocean. It had survived the first meal by calling the meal a trick. It did not survive the letter, because now the comparison was not between German soldier and American soldier. It was between his mother and his captors, between home and prison, between sacrifice promised as sacred and abundance handled like paperwork. Autumn brought classes, English first, then mathematics, bookkeeping, agricultural mechanics, even lectures on American government. Some delivered badly, some well, some by volunteers from nearby towns who seemed both curious and nervous about teaching men who had once worn the enemy's uniform. Johann enrolled in English because he wanted to understand the newspapers without waiting for Peter Falk. His teacher was Miss Ruth Ellison, a retired school teacher from Pickens County. She had silver hair, wire, framed spectacles, and a voice that could cut through barracks, noise like chalk across a blackboard. She treated the German prisoners exactly as she had treated school children for 35 years. She corrected them, interrupted them, assigned homework, praised effort only when effort deserved it. The men adored and feared her. One evening, Johann asked her why Americans were allowed to criticize their leaders in wartime. Miss Ellison paused with chalk in her hand. "Because leaders are not the country," she said. Johann repeated the sentence slowly, translating it inside himself. Leaders are not the country. In Germany, that distinction had been burned away. The leader, the party, the army, the state, the family, the future, the dead, the unborn, the flag. All had been pressed into one object, and men were told that to question one part was to betray all parts. Miss Ellison made the separation sound as ordinary as grammar. A subject, a verb. And object leaders are not the country. That night, Johann wrote the sentence in his notebook 12 times. Not because he wanted to memorize English, because he wanted to believe there was a language in which the sentence could exist. By Christmas, the camp had become a strange moral weather system. There were still guards, still fences, still roll calls, still officers who reminded the prisoners that they had lost freedom and would not regain it until governments decided the matter. No one could mistake it for home, yet inside the limits, there were concerts, handmade chessboards, classes, chapel services, work details, arguments, soccer games, letters and meals that kept arriving with the terrifying reliability of sunrise. The Christmas dinner broke some men more thoroughly than the surrender had. Turkey, dressing, potatoes, gravy, canned cranberry sauce, rolls, cake, coffee, small packages from church groups with soap, pencils, candy, and writing paper. The decorations were not elaborate: paper chains, a tree, a few crooked ornaments. But to the prisoners, who had expected a holiday marked only by the ache of absence, the room became unbearable. Karl Weiss, the baker's son, cried openly into his napkin. Peter Falk stared at the paper chains and said nothing. Ernst Vogt drank coffee with both hands around the cup, and did not tell anyone to be careful. Johann thought of his mother again, then of his students, then of the boys in his old classroom who had been taught maps before they had been taught mercy. He realized that what the Americans were giving them was not forgiveness. Not exactly. Forgiveness is intimate. This was broader and more impersonal. They were giving them standards: a standard ration, a standard medical exam, a standard Christmas package, a standard rule that prisoners remained human even after they had been enemies. Germany had asked its people to surrender standards in the name of destiny. America, for all its contradictions, was demonstrating the force of keeping some standards even when hatred would have excused dropping them. That thought stayed with Johann longer than the meal. In early 1945, the news narrowed. The Russians were moving from the east. The Western Allies were across the Rhine. German cities became names, spoken with a lowered voice. Even the loyalists stopped predicting victory aloud. They changed tactics. They spoke of honor, of endurance, of secret weapons of betrayal, of history reversing itself at the last second. But the camp had become hostile ground for fantasy, not because the guards argued. The guards mostly did not care to argue. Fantasy failed because breakfast kept arriving, because newspapers kept arriving, because work trucks kept leaving and returning with fuel, because American boys in clean boots complained about coffee that German prisoners would have crossed a battlefield to taste, because supply sheds remained full, because machinery broke and was repaired, because a country supposedly rotting from softness continued to operate. Day after day, ordinary abundance became a hammer, not loud, not dramatic, just repeated until the old story cracked through. When the announcement finally came in May that Germany had surrendered, the camp did not erupt. Relief moved through the barracks first, then grief. Then a silence so complete it seemed to press against the walls. Men sat on bunks. Men walked outside and stood under the Alabama heat. Men folded letters. Men prayed. Men who had lost brothers felt the loss fresh again, because there was no longer a future victory to make the deaths mean what they had been promised to mean. Dieter Schramm took off the insignia from his tunic and placed it in a small envelope. Ernst Vogt watched him do it. For a moment, Johann thought Vogt might object. Instead, the sergeant turned away. That was his surrender. Not the public announcement, not the signature in Europe. Just a tired man deciding there was no sentence left to defend. Repatriation did not come immediately. The prisoners waited through summer. They worked, studied, read, argued about what Germany would become. Some feared the ruins. Some feared the Russians. Some feared returning to families who might no longer recognize them. Johann feared the classroom. He knew he would teach again if Germany gave him walls, children, and chalk. But he no longer knew how to stand before a child and speak with certainty. Miss Ellison told him that was a beginning, not a failure. Certainty is useful for arithmetic, she said. Be careful where else you put it. On his last week in Aliceville, Johann walked to the fence near the road where the farm trucks passed. Beyond it were pine trees, dust, insects, heat, and a country that had defeated him partly by refusing to become the monster he had been promised. He did not love America. That would make the story too simple. He had seen enough to know Americans could be blind, unfair, loud, ignorant, generous, practical and contradictory all at once. But he had seen something that mattered more than love. He had seen a working society strong enough to feed enemies, argue in print, repair mistakes, move food through warehouses, and keep ordinary promises. That was not perfection, it was capacity. And capacity had beaten mythology. When Johann finally crossed the Atlantic back to Europe, he carried no trophy, only a notebook inside were English words, ration comparisons, copied newspaper lines, farm vocabulary classroom phrases from Miss Ellison, and one sentence underlined so hard the pencil had cut the page. Leaders are not the country. He returned to a Germany of broken roofs, displaced families, missing men, and children who had learned too early to stop asking adults for the truth. In 1946, Johann began teaching in a temporary classroom inside a church annex, with cracked plaster and borrowed benches. He taught arithmetic because children needed numbers that did not lie. He taught English because the future would require more than one language. He taught history carefully, painfully, with pauses where pride used to go. And when older students asked him what changed his mind, he did not begin with a battle. He did not begin with surrender. He did not begin with speeches, flags, or commanders. He began with a tray, a metal tray in Alabama, beef, potatoes, cornbread, coffee, peach cobbler, enough food for an enemy soldier, served by a bored cook who did not know he was holding a weapon. Because the most devastating proof Johann Reiter ever saw was not designed to humiliate him. It was not shouted through a loudspeaker. It was not printed on a leaflet. It was placed in front of him 3 times a day until the lie had nowhere left to stand. The war did not end for Johann when the guns stopped. It ended the first time he understood what that meal meant. Germany had fed him certainty and called it truth. America fed him lunch, and lunch proved more durable.